Hello, this is Shmuel Moshe, and you are listening to a special Purim episode of the Weekly Parashahcast, the show where I read the scripture and provide my own interpretations of what I think it all means. As mentioned, this is a special episode coinciding with a holiday, so we're going to be diving into the text related to that holiday, and very good to do so, as it is said to be a command for all the people of Israel to hear the story of Esther, specifically to hear the scripture itself. Now, we're of course doing this in English, so it will not be the full expectation of hearing it in Hebrew, but I suppose there's a beauty to hearing this story told in a foreign language, as this entire story takes place in a foreign nation. So with all of that said, once again, I want to remind everybody I'm not a professional scholar, just somebody who wanted to study the scripture. We're going to go ahead and jump in with our episode for Purim 5785, falling in the month of Adar, March 2025 in the Gregorian calendar. Let's go ahead and jump on in. My English translation comes from Chabad.org. Chapter 1 of the Scroll of Esther, Verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, he was the Ahasuerus who reigned from Hodu to Cush, 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a banquet for all his princes and his servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces who were before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty, many days, 180 days. When these days were over, the king made for all the people present in Shushan the capital, for everyone both great and small, a banquet for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's orchard. There were spreads of white, fine cotton, and blue, embroidered with cords of linen and purple. On silver rods and marble columns, couches of gold and silver, on a pavement of green, white shell, and onyx marble. And they gave them to drink in golden vessels, and the vessels differed from one another, and royal wine was plentiful according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, with no one coercing, for so had the king ordained upon every steward of his house to do according to every man's wish. Also Vashti the queen had made a banquet for the women, in the royal house of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizetta, Harbona, Bigta, and Abagta, Zetar, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains who ministered in the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was of comely appearance. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's behest, which was brought by the hand of the chamberlains, and the king became very wroth, and his anger burnt within him. And the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for so was the king's custom, to present the case before all who knew law and judgment, and the nearest to him were Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face, who sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what shall be done to Queen Vashti, inasmuch as she did not comply with the order of the king brought by the hand of the chamberlains? Then Memucan declared before the king and princes, Not against the king alone has Vashti the queen done wrong, but against all the princes and all the peoples that are in all King Ahasuerus' provinces. For the word of the queen will spread to all the women, to make them despise their husbands in their eyes, when they say, King Ahasuerus ordered to bring Vashti the queen before him, but she did not come. And this day the princesses of Persia and Media who heard the word of the queen will say the like to all the princes of the king, and there will be much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let a royal edict go forth from before him, and let it be inscribed in the laws of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked, that Vashti shall not come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to her peer who is better than she. And let the verdict of the king be heard throughout his entire kingdom, although it is great, and all the women shall give honor to their husbands, both great and small. And the matter pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every nationality according to his language, that every man dominate in his household and speak according to the language of his nationality. All right, end of chapter 1. So a quick summary. Here we meet the great and magnanimous, glorious, wonderful king Ahasuerus, who has been hosting a phenomenal banquet in the 3rd year of his reign for all the princes and servants, all of the army of Persia, the nobles, the princes of the provinces. So we need to get some context here, and I am actually quite excited to be doing this episode because many times in the regular show, I've referenced the Persian Empire, and so it's only fitting that we now finally get to see a direct starring role of the Persians in a story of the Jewish people. Now, all of this section has nothing to do with the Jews. This is entirely about Persian custom. So, first off, let it be known that during these days of Persia, this became a sort of gradual thing in the generations that followed the original King Cyrus. So, it's worth establishing which king of Persia is Ahasuerus. There are different opinions. Some say he's Xerxes the First. Some say he's Artaxerxes. I think Artaxerxes sounds more like Ahasuerus, whereas Shverosh would be like regular Xerxes. Ahasuerus sounds like Artaxerxes. But there's also another challenge here. The Persians would often reuse the same names, which is not uncommon in many kingdoms, and even among the Jewish people, where you name people after other people. It was common to see somebody named Xerxes the First, Xerxes the Second, Xerxes the Third, and so on. So we don't know exactly which Persian king this is, but we do know with certainty the ways of the Persian people. The Persians are a very interesting historical culture and nation. They are an empire that ruled completely over this entire region of the Middle East, expanding outward in several directions. They are the same people that warred with the Greeks during the Greco-Persian War. People hear about the Battle of the 300 Spartans in Thermopylae. That is against Xerxes the First, who is the grandson of Cyrus, the son of Darius. So he's like the 3rd king ever of Persia's empire. So I mean, this is like a really this empire has such a massive influence across all of the world that isn't like China and the United States era. The North American continent, right? There's obviously no U.S. at this time, but even like Western Europe, this whole section of just the Middle East and extending outward, reaching into the Greek Mediterranean. So this is really the region, just to kind of give you a perspective of where this is located. This is everything, and it's 127 provinces. So this is the full might of the Persian Empire. This empire will not be stopped until Alexander the Great shows up and conquers it. So this is a really significant empire. Now, there are some other things that are significant about the Persians as well, which we'll go more into. But the most important of them in relation to the Jewish people is that the Persians are the ones who defeated the Babylonians. The Babylonians, the ones being the responsible for exiling the Jews and all the Israelites. I shouldn't say the Jews. It should really be the Israelites, right? The kingdom of Judea, which included all the different Israelites under their banner of one king, but really was the different 12 tribes. So the Babylonians are the ones who conquered the Jews, or the Israelites, again, saying the right term. The children of Israel were conquered by Babylon, and then the Persians defeated the Babylonians. And it is recorded that the Persians sent them home. And this was very typical. So of the Persians, basically their policy of warfare was earth and water. If the Persians showed up to you at your doorstep, this was the policy instituted by Cyrus, the first great king. It was, rather than we just show up, conquer, and enslave you, we're going to give you a nicer option. You give us earth and water, which is basically meaning you show us your submission, and we will not cast you amongst the nations. We will not exile you and enslave you. We will show you mercy. You will simply become one of our provinces. You will pay us taxes. You will give us soldiers, but otherwise you will remain as you were. That is the mercy of Persia. If we look inside of the Torah, it's not tremendously different from what is said of how the Jews are supposed to, again, the Israelites are supposed to conduct themselves, right? So it says, with the exception of the specific tribes of people that are supposed to be pushed out of the promised land, right? So the Jebusites, the Hittites, and so on. It says that any other people that you come into contact with, you give them this same offer, earth and water, right? So it says if you approach them and they submit to you, they become your servants. Well, this is exactly what the Persian policy is. If they don't submit to you, you destroy them. Again, very similar to the Persian policy. Alexander the Great would also use this policy. So this is really, really important because it is unusual in this time period to have such a policy of magnanimity, like such kindness to the conquered people that you don't even have to conquer. You just say, hey, submit to us, you will know peace. All you have to do is become our vassal state, which again has a biblical context. So I do think it's very, very significant. And again, we are now looking at a time period where it is said all of the Israelites live in Persia now, because didn't Cyrus say, go back to your own country? But obviously the Persians were just such good rulers that it seems they all went into Persia. So anyhow, let's go ahead and continue here talking more about this great feast. It was not unusual. The Persians were extremely wealthy. The king of Persia was the most wealthy there was. And so it was not unusual during specific things such as celebrations to have these just outrageous parties. And this is a banquet, it says, lasted 180 days. So this is incredible. Like, he's spending 180 days during his third year as the king to show off, look how much the king has. And finally, at the end of the 180 days, there is a final banquet for 7 days. This is for the people of Shushan. So this is the capital. You might also hear it referred to as Susa. All the people of Susa, and what's also interesting about Susa or Shushan is that it is filled with people of different heritages and nationalities. It is a capital city where the most celebrated and trusted advisors and allies and princes from different kingdoms are brought to stay near the king. They serve in an advisory capacity. They serve as loyal vassals. This is regularly referred to. If you want some more Persian history, the most obvious primer to go to is none other than the histories recorded by Herodotus, who is a Greek who took tremendous efforts to document the Persians and as well as the Greek traditions. And this is also where I get a lot of my information about the relationship of the Persians with nearby countries, particularly the history of the Persian people, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes. They are all spoken of at great length because of their relationships with the Greeks and the surrounding areas. So if you want to know more about Persia, I highly recommend that historical document of the histories by Herodotus. Though some question its historicity because he is very theatrical, there's nobody else who documented it better. So take it as you will, but it gives you a lot of context for why the Persians are behaving this way in this scroll of Esther. So now we see this you need to really understand the scale of the Persian Empire to understand why this is happening and why this is not an exaggeration necessarily of 180 days he showed off the wealth of Persia. They could afford to. They were the king of the world, right? And from there, we see now there's a final banquet with all these glorious things, with all of Susa in attendance, and it gives to all the people to drink golden vessels, and it's all just glorious. And it says the vessels differed from one another, probably possible that they came from different nations, but nevertheless, the drinking was according to the law, with no one coercing. For so had the king ordained upon every steward of his house to do according to every man's wish. So this is basically the king saying, my friends, enjoy yourself. This is the ultimate luxury, and you are my guests, so have the time of your life. Now, at the same time, Queen Vashti is hosting her own banquet for the women. And this is, as this is all going on, she's hosting the women. The king says, I'm drunk. I'm very drunk, and I want to show everybody my beautiful wife. Hey, go get the queen and tell her to come here. I want her to show off for everybody. And so they send, on behalf of the king, the chamberlains to go get the queen. And they say, hey, the king has summoned you to come present yourself before the people as part of his royal banquet. But the queen says, no, I'm not going to do that. She refuses. Now, this is very bad. The king is furious. And this is understandable. And it's also really, really significant because as we're going to go over again here, so the king, he's angry, but he doesn't make a decision on his own. Instead, he turns to the wise men. So what is this situation with the wise men who know the king's custom, right? Or they know the laws. So basically, the king does not act without consulting his experts. And different princes of Persia and Media who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. Some context here as well. Who are these 7 princes of Persia and Media? So I'm extrapolating the answer here. This might not be correct. This is based on my own knowledge of Persia. But during the time of Darius, it was so that first Cyrus was king, then Cambyses, who is said to have gone crazy, he was usurped by Darius, and then Darius, who did the coup, he had with him his conspirators. And so after they overthrew the king, the Persian conspirators, who were not Darius, but his closest friends, all became basically the most honored families in Persia alongside him. Now, it's also significant. It says Persia and Media, the Midianites and the Persians. This kingdom is the kingdom of Cyrus, because Cyrus, the first king of Persia, we always say Persia, 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 but Cyrus was actually a mixture of Persian and Mede. So he was a fusion of the two races of Persians and Medians. And this is why it says the 7 princes of Persia and Media. This kingdom is the combo of Persia and Media, not just one, not just the other. This is the legacy of Cyrus. And Darius's wife was one of Cyrus's daughters, so it works out in that way. Anyway, that would imply that this bloodline is still of that fusion. But the 7 princes who all... I feel bad almost, because this is supposed to be about the story of Esther, but I've now spent so much time talking about the Persian kingdom. But I feel this is very important because it helps us understand the mindset, the logic of what the king does from a Persian-centric perspective. So often we tell this story from the perspective of the Israelites, the Jews, Esther, Mordecai, but we don't hear it from the Persian perspective. And so while I'm not an expert on Persia, I can at least provide this context. So it shows that the Persian Empire still maintains some of its traditions, including having these closest advisors to the king, being these princes of Persia and Midian, right? So these are the ones who are of those royal esteemed families, and nevertheless, they're the ones that the king can trust most. So Memucan, he makes a very, very good point. He says, not against the king alone has the queen done wrong, but against all of Persia, basically. Because what she has done is she has shown the women of Persia that they can say no to the king. And if the queen can say no to the king, then all the wives can say no to their husbands. And this is not acceptable. This is going to set a very bad precedent that will affect every single man in the kingdom. So in doing so, she has just caused a socio-political problem for all of the men, because the women are now going to disrespect their husbands just as the queen disrespected the king. So with this being said, let there be a royal edict that tells everybody that from now on, Vashti shall not come before King Ahasuerus, and she is going to lose her royal position to someone else. So in other words, there will be consequences. This punishment is that the queen will no longer be the queen. She is basically exiled. Now, some might say she was killed, but it doesn't say that. It says, let her never appear before the king again. So maybe she was simply exiled. Fundamentally, this means death in a social sense, so it doesn't really matter. What matters here is that this ruling was, in the eyes of the king and the other nobles and the princes and everybody, this was a just and good ruling. So they made it the official policy, and so it says every nationality heard this, right? So it says letters to all the provinces, to every province according to its script, every nationality according to its language, every man dominate in his household and speak according to the language of his nationality. So ultimately, the significance here is pretty great as well. Notice that it says that every nationality according to its language. So if this was sent to, let's say, Greece, the Greeks would be receiving this in Greek. The Hebrews would be receiving this in Hebrew. And he will rule his household, the man will rule his household over his wife according to the language of his nationality. So we see the preservation of these international cultures. Again, this is not a culture that relishes in destroying other cultures. The Persians quite differently incorporate cultures. They bring them in. This is a benefit of the Persian Empire. They gain all of the knowledge that comes from the cultures that they integrate. So this is a very important position to have. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to chapter 2 in the Scroll of Esther, verse 1. After these events, when King Ahasuerus's fury subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed upon her. And the king's young men, his servants, said, "Let them seek for the king young maidens of comely appearance. And let the king appoint commissioners to all the provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every young maiden of comely appearance to Shushan the capital, to the house of the women, to the custody of Heg, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, and let their ointments be given them. And let the maiden who pleases the king reign instead of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did so. There was a Judean man in Shushan the capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exile that was exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. And he had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maiden was of comely form and of comely appearance. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her to himself for a daughter. And it came to pass, when the king's order and his decree were heard, and when many maidens were gathered to Shushan the capital, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, the keeper of women. And the maiden pleased him, and she won his favor. And he hastened her ointments and her portions to give them to her, and the 7 maidens fitting to give her from the king's house. And he changed her and her maidens to the best portions in the house of the women. Esther did not reveal her nationality or her lineage, for Mordecai had ordered her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the house of the women, to learn of Esther's welfare and what would be done to her. And when each maiden's turn arrived to go to King Ahasuerus, after having been treated according to the practice prescribed for the women for 12 months, for so were the days of their ointments completed, 6 months with myrrh oil and 6 months with perfumes, and with the ointments of the women. Then with this the maiden would come to the king. Whatever she would request would be given to her to come with her from the house of the women to the king's house. In the evening she would go, and in the morning she would return to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, the guard of the concubines. She would no longer come to the king unless the king wanted her, and she was called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, Mordecai's uncle, who had taken her for a daughter, came to go into the king, she requested nothing except what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the guard of the women, would say. And Esther obtained grace in the eyes of all who beheld her. So Esther was taken to Ahasuerus to his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor before him more than all the maidens, and he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king made a great banquet for all his provinces and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he granted a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the bounty of the king. And when the maidens were gathered a second time, and Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Esther would not tell her lineage or her nationality, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther kept Mordecai's orders as she had when she was raised by him. In those days, when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains of the guards of the threshold, became angry and sought to lay a hand on King Ahasuerus. And the matter became known to Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in Mordecai's name. And the matter was investigated and found to be so, and they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the diary that was read before the king. End of chapter 2. So, I want to quickly clarify before I go into the full description here, the diary that was read before the king, this is also referred to as the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia. So it's basically like an important book that dictates the history of the Persian kings and the empire and so on. So now let's go ahead and get into the full explanation. This is breaking down how Esther becomes the new queen. So as is traditional here, when they're looking for a new perfect woman for the king, they will all be selected from the many women that are of the kingdom. So here we learn about Mordecai. Now it says Mordecai is the son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now, how convenient, the son of Kish. Is he also, or is he not the son of Kish? All right, for those who were listening to the Weekly Parashahcast, it's so beautiful how this all lined up. So this was said about King Saul. Is he also not a son of Kish? So is this the same Kish that is the father of Saul? It may very well be. So here we have the possibility that Mordecai is descended from the same line that sired Saul the king, but definitely from the tribe of Benjamin. not the tribe of Judah. I bring this point up again because we refer to Judea as the kingdom, but the Israelites are more than just Jews. That would just be the tribe of Judah. This is a Benjamite, which means Esther herself is also from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, as it says, exiled from Jerusalem with the exile that was exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. So this is, again, during that time period when the Hebrews are in exile, they go to Babylon, they are saved by the Persians, and there is a reinstatement. And let's go so far as to even say that King Cyrus during that time is said to have been responsible for helping to rebuild the temple. So again, the Persian Empire is a friend, not an enemy, historically speaking. But many people today will probably tell you how evil the king of Persia is. I am choosing a different position. I am choosing one that looks at historical context. The Persians are not the enemy of the Jews, even if this story leads one to believe so. So now let's continue from here. We learn about Esther. She is adopted by Mordecai because her parents are gone, and so basically raises her as his own daughter. And so she is taken along with all the other maidens to be presented for the king. It takes 12 months to prep a woman to be shown to the king, and she's basically going to get one shot to earn the king's favor. Now, as it happens, she is absolutely adored by the person in charge of them, right? So because of this, she gets all the special treatment. Mordecai would regularly walk in front of the court and just kind of take a look and see how just so he could see how his Esther was doing, right? So sure enough, it was after these 12 months that all the women would be pampered and treated, that they would go present themselves. Now, Esther, as it happens, was beautiful and also had a great personality. So in her case, when she went up, she was very special. She was not just already pampered to be top dog and given all of the accoutrements that would come with the top woman. But also it says that when women went to present themselves to the king, they were allowed to request anything be given with them. So in other words, when you're going to present yourself to the king, maybe as part of your attempt to appeal to him, you could request any performance items like, hey, bring a hula hoop so I can, or bring a lyre so I can play music for him, whatever it is. It says that Esther did not do something like this. She requested nothing except whatever Haggai, the king's chamberlain, guard of the women, would say. So in other words, she trusted her local expert and only did exactly what was told of her, and also trusted Mordecai and did not reveal her heritage. And so she was made queen in place of Vashti. This results in a great banquet. Same thing with Esther also getting a banquet, but she keeps her situation a secret. Mordecai is sitting in the king's gate and observing everything. Now, while he's doing this, he overhears an assassination plot to get rid of the king. She finds out through Mordecai. So Mordecai tells Esther. Esther tells the king and says, I learned this from Mordecai the Jew. And so they investigate it. It turns out it's true, and it's written in the diary or the chronicle of the Persians that this is something that happened thanks to Mordecai. So Mordecai the Jew gets recorded as the one who saved the king. Now let's go ahead and move on to chapter 3. Verse 1, Scroll of Esther. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and placed his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and prostrate themselves before Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself. Then the king's servants who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you disobey the king's orders? Now it came to pass when they said this to him daily, and he did not heed them, that they told this to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand up, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself before him, Haman became full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible to him to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him Mordecai's nationality, and Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King of Ahasuerus, one cast the pur, that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered and separate among the peoples throughout all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws differ from those of every people, and they do not keep the king's laws. It is therefore of no use for the king to let them be. If it pleases the king, let it be written to destroy them, and I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents into the hands of those who perform the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring off his hand and gave it to Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, This silver is given to you, and the people to do to them as it pleases you. And the king's scribes were summoned in the first month, on the 13th day thereof. And it was written according to everything that Haman had ordered to the king's satraps, and to the governors who were over every province, and to the princes of every people, each province according to its script, and each people according to its tongue. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and it was sealed with the king's ring. And letters shall be sent by the hand of the couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, kill, and cause to perish all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and their spoils to be taken as plunder. The copy of the writ was for an edict to be given in every province, published to all the peoples, to be ready for that day. The couriers went forth in haste by the king's order, and the edict was given in Shushan the capital, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was perturbed. End of chapter 3. So here we get introductions to Haman. So during this time, this is a very good comparison. If you want to think of who is Haman, it's not very different from when the Pharaoh appointed Joseph to be his right-hand man. That is what Ahasuerus has done with Haman. He has appointed Haman to be his right-hand man. He now is considered his most trusted advisor and servant above all the princes. And so here it says that the king had made a command that everybody should bow down before Haman, just as they would with the king, right? Bow down before him. But Mordecai does not do so. Now, the king's servants go, Why do you disobey? And he says, I don't, because I have a tradition that doesn't let me do so. And so they tell Haman about this, and Haman goes and tests it out, and it turns out it's true. So as it says, they ask, why do you do it? And he did not heed them. They told Haman. So it doesn't even say that he explained why. It just says, why do you disobey? But Mordecai just simply didn't do it. So it could be that he kept his peace, but instead they told him, oh, it's because he's a Jew. So Haman tests it out, and he gets mad because it turns out, yep, the Jew, Mordecai, will not bow down before Haman. So in response to this, he takes it so personally, he says, I'm going to not just get rid of this Mordecai, I'm going to destroy his entire people. So he casts lots, right? So he's looking for the right time. He's basically trying to divine the correct answer. And the answer comes forth, okay, now we've got it. I'm going to do this on this day. I'm going to go and talk to the king. So he goes to the king, and he presents it in a different way. He says, there's a certain people scattered and separate among the peoples throughout all the provinces of your kingdom with different laws, and they don't keep your laws. Therefore, they're useless to you. So he says, if it pleases the king, let it be written to destroy them, and I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents into the hands of those who do it. So the king, this is another Persian trope here, charity or generosity. He offers him 10,000 pieces of silver, 10,000 talents to destroy them. And the king says, the silver is given to you, and the people to do to them as it pleases you. So, interestingly, it says, Ahasuerus is saying, you don't need to give the king's treasury 10,000. In other words, Haman is saying, I will pay you 10,000 silver. And the king says, no, you take 10,000 silver, and you do with them whatever you want. So, in other words, the king is rewarding Haman for his faithful behavior. This is not uncommon among Persians. They see somebody being charitable, And it is traditionally their custom, the king, in response to being offered some degree of charity from a loyal servant, that the Persians would often say, no, no, no. In fact, let me give you what you were going to give me. This is just how they tend to repay good with good. So the king trusts Haman. I've heard people call Ahasuerus evil and wicked and blah, blah, blah. Maybe he is. But from a Persian perspective, he is just the king of Persia doing what the king of Persia always does. He trusts his top guy, and he says, I leave them to do with you as you please. He gives him the ring, and he writes the edict in the name of Ahasuerus. The signet ring is, again, to compare to Joseph with Pharaoh, this is exactly what Pharaoh did with Joseph. He gave him the ring. So now we find out that it is written that all the Jews, man, women, and child, will be destroyed, and the spoils will be taken as plunder. In other words, you can kill the Jews and take whatever they've got for yourself. And this is sent out to everybody, and the whole city is disturbed by this. Chapter 4, verse 1. And Mordecai knew all that had transpired, and Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And he came up as far as the king's gate, for one may not enter the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's orders and his edict reached, there was a great mourning for the Jews, and fasting and weeping and lamenting. Sackcloth and ashes were put on the most prominent. And Esther's maidens and her chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was extremely terrified. And she sent clothing to dress Mordecai, and to take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept it. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed before her, and she commanded him concerning Mordecai to know what this was and why this was. So Hathach set forth to Mordecai, to the city square, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had befallen him, and the full account of the silver that Haman had proposed to weigh out into the king's treasuries on the Jews' account, to cause them to perish. And the copy of the writ of the decree that was given in Shushan he gave him to show Esther, and to tell her, and to order her to come before the king to beseech him, and to beg him for her people. And Hathach came and told Esther what Mordecai had said. And Esther said to Hathach, and she ordered him to tell Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who comes to the king into the inner court, who is not summoned, there is but one law for him, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king extends the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been summoned to come to the king these 30 days. And they told Esther's words to Mordecai. And Mordecai ordered the reply to Esther, do not imagine yourself that you will escape in the king's house from among all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and rescue will arise for the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's household will perish. And who knows whether at a time like this you will attain the kingdom. Then Esther ordered to reply to Mordecai, go, assemble all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day and night. Also I and my maidens will fast in a like manner. Then I will go to the king contrary to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai passed, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. End of chapter 4. So here we find out that Mordecai learns of the plan to destroy the Jews. He sees the edict, and he goes into mourning. He tears his clothes. He wears sackcloth. He puts ash on himself. This is a position of wretchedness and mourning. So he comes to the king's gate, and it's clearly not acceptable. Now, all across the empire, the Jews are apparently in mourning as well. Now, Esther hears about what's going on, and Mordecai being so horribly dressed, she sends clothing to get him properly dressed, and he refuses. And then she sends one of the king's chamberlains, who was appointed to be her chamberlain, tells him to go to Mordecai and see what's going on. And so then Mordecai tells what's going on, and this gets back to Esther, and Esther is absolutely shocked. This is just horrible news. And so, but he also said, tell Esther to go and beg the king to spare the people, basically. And she says, Mordecai, I can't do that because I haven't been summoned by the king. And if you go to the king without being summoned, unless he touches you with his golden scepter and extends it to you, you're going to be executed. And so Mordecai says to her something very, very, very smart. He says to her, if you don't do this, someone else will. In other words, this is a chance for you to do the right thing for the people. But if you don't, the honor will go to someone else, while you and your father's household will perish. Now, who knows whether at a time like this you will attain the kingdom? In other words, if you don't do it, someone else will, and you might lose everything in the process. So there you go. So Esther, she understands what he's saying, but she's still nervous. So she says, have all the Jews assemble and fast on my behalf, all the Jews in Shushan. 3 days do not eat or drink. Also, I and my maidens will do the same, and I will go to the king contrary to the law, and if I die, I die. And so Mordecai does as she says. Everybody fasts, and she will now present herself to the king. Time for chapter 5. Verse 1, Book of Esther. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther clothed herself regally, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house, opposite the king's house. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal palace, opposite the entrance of the house. And it came to pass when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she won favor in his eyes. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. And the king said to her, What concerns you, Queen Esther? And what is your petition? Even to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. And Esther said, If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, Rush Haman to do Esther's bidding. And the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said to Esther during the wine banquet, What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther replied and said, My petition and my request are as follows. If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I will make for them, and tomorrow I will do the king's bidding. And Haman went out on that day, happy and with a cheerful heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he neither rose nor stirred because of him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. But Haman restrained himself, and he came home, and he sent and brought his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his sons, and all the ways that the king had promoted him, and that he had exalted him over the princes and the king's servants. And Haman said, Esther did not even bring anyone to the party that she made except me, and tomorrow, too, I am invited to her with the king. But all this is worth nothing to me, every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. And Zeresh his wife and all his friends said, Let them make gallows 50 cubits high, and in the morning say to the king that they should hang Mordecai on it, and go to the king to the banquet joyfully. The matter pleased Haman, and he made the gallows. End of chapter 5. So here we get Esther making her petition. She takes the chance and she goes to see the king. The king welcomes her and extends the royal scepter, and he asks, What is your concern and what is your petition? And she invites them, both the king and Haman, to her banquet, and then he says, Okay, very well. Now, what's your petition? And she says, My petition and request are as follows. If I have found favor in your eyes, come to the banquet I'll make tomorrow, and then I will do your bidding. In other words, I will tell you my request once you have come to my banquet tomorrow with Haman. And so it seems this is the plan. Haman goes out, and he's having a great old time because he just had a great day. He's top dog. He got invited to the queen's banquet, just like the king. He's feeling good. And so now everything is great until he sees Mordecai, who once again does not honor him with rising or bowing or anything. He just basically ignores Haman, and this makes him mad. So what ends up happening is that Haman goes home, and he starts saying to his friends and family, Oh, I am the best. I got all this money. I got all these sons. I've got everything. I even got invited to the queen's banquet. But none of that means anything because every time I see that Mordecai, he makes me mad. And so his wife and all his friends say, Well, why don't you just have them make some tall gallows and tomorrow tell the king to hang that guy? And he's like, Yeah, that sounds good to me. Good plan. So now we move on to chapter 6. Verse 1, Book of Esther. On that night the king's sleep was disturbed, and he ordered to bring the book of the records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had reported about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 chamberlains of the king, of the guards of the threshold, who had sought to lay a hand on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor and greatness was done to Mordecai on that account?" And the servants of the king, who minister before him, said, "Nothing was done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" And Haman had come to the outside court of the king's house to petition the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him enter." And Haman entered, and the king said to him, "What should be done to a man whom the king wishes to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "A man who the king wishes to honor. Let them bring the royal raiment that the king wore, and the horse that the king rode upon, and the royal crown should be placed on his head. And let the raiment and the horse be delivered into the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, and let them dress the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let them parade him on the horse in the city square, and announce before him, 'So shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the raiment and the horse as you have spoken, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken." And Haman took the raiment and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and paraded him in the city square, and announced before him, "So shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor." And Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman rushed home mourning and with his head covered. And Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife, and to all his friends all that had befallen him. And his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him." While they were talking to him still, the king's chamberlains arrived, and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. End of chapter 6. So here we have a very significant incident happen. The king is unable to sleep, or it says his sleep was disturbed. And so he orders them to bring the book of records, or the diary as referred to in the early parts of the story, where I mentioned the Chronicles of Persia. So he asks them to bring me the records. Now, what most likely happened was that he had a bad dream. This is not uncommon, especially among kings of the era, to have dreams. And the Persians in particular, we talk about the ancestry of Cyrus. Before Cyrus was made king, his grandfather had a dream that led him to try to get rid of Cyrus. So dreams are very important to the Persian people. Anyway, I guess they were important to all peoples back then. He has trouble sleeping. So whether he had a bad dream or he wakes up in the middle of the night or he just can't sleep, he says, "There's something bothering me. Bring me the book of records. Read me the Chronicles." So in other words, because he's the king, why isn't he resting peacefully? Well, he knows that he has done something wrong. Such is the way of the Persian kings. He knows he's done something wrong. So let me hear what I've done. Oh, wait a minute. That story, that Mordecai fellow, what was done for him after he saved my life? Nothing. That's the problem. So the king has found the answer. He needs to make up for not having helped Mordecai before. He needs to honor this great helper. So Haman, at the same time, is on the way in to go and try to petition the king. The king asks, "Who is in the court?" So Haman happens to be the one that's there, but the king is basically asking, "Who's here? Because I need someone to give me some advice. So who among my people is here to advise me?" And it happens to be Haman. So he invites him in, and he says, "Haman, what should the king do to somebody he wants to honor?" Now Haman, very, very foolish and arrogantly, thinks, well, who else but me would the king want to honor? So he thinks of the best thing he can think of. He's going to have this guy paraded around in the king's clothes, on the king's horse, pulled by one of the king's top guys, and he's going to tell everybody, this is who the king wants to honor. And so he's telling him this plan, and he's got like a smile on the inside, like, I'm going to get the best day ever. And then the king says to him, "Good. Do that for Mordecai the Jew." And I could just imagine, in a cartoony sense, the overwhelming sense of like, as this hits Haman on the inside, he's just like, what? How can this be happening? This can't be happening. No way. Yeah, and this is what's going on. So sure enough, the man who he hates most, he is now forced to parade around as the king has said. So Mordecai is brought around, and as he goes home, he tells everybody at home, can you believe this happened? And he's just absolutely devastated. Like, he's just beside himself. And his wife says to him, if Mordecai is Jewish, you're screwed. You are going to go down because this is a warning sign. And now, as they're still talking to him, the chamberlain arrives and says, it's time to go to Esther's banquet, and they whisk him away. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. And the king said to Esther, also on the second day during the wine feast, what is your petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be given to you. And what is your request even up to half the kingdom? And it shall be granted. And Queen Esther replied and said, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, may my life be given me in my petition and my people in my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Now, had we been sold for slaves and bondswomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary has no consideration for the king's loss. And King Ahasuerus said, and he said to Queen Esther, who is this, and where is he who dared to do this? And Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, this evil Haman. And Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his fury from the wine feast to the orchard garden, and Haman stood to beg for his life of Queen Esther, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Then the king returned from the orchard garden to the house of the wine feast, and Haman was falling on the couch upon which Esther was. And the king said, will you even force the queen with me in the house? The word came out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. Then said Harbonah, one of the chamberlains before the king, also, behold the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke well for the king, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on it. And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's anger abated. End of chapter 7. So here we have the great feast of Esther, where she springs the most incredible reversal. She is with the king and Haman, and the king says, Esther, once again, tell me your petition, and you shall have it. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. And she says, my king, if I have found favor in your eyes, please spare me and my people, because we have been sold to be destroyed, slain, and perish. And if we had just been sold as slaves, I would not say anything. But clearly, the one who did this has no consideration for the king's loss. In other words, he doesn't care how much it's going to hurt the king. And the king says, who dares to do this to my Esther? And Esther says, an adversary and enemy? It's Haman, the guy right next to us. It's him. And he is now beside himself in anger. Ahasuerus is mad. So he storms off, and clearly on his face, Haman can see that the king is going to do something evil to him. So while he's out in the orchard pacing in anger, Haman is begging Queen Esther to save her. Please save me, right? And he's on his hands and knees. He's kneeling on her couch, basically, where she's sitting like, oh, queen, please help me. I'm so sorry. But as the king comes back, he sees Haman with his hands and like all about Esther's couch. So in other words, he sees her being preyed upon by Haman. He sees Haman putting himself in front of Esther on her couch, and he says, now when I leave the room, you try to force yourself on my wife? Oh, what should be done with you, you scoundrel? And so Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, says, Mordecai, right? Remember Mordecai? Haman built gallows to hang Mordecai, the man who you honored. And they're hanging in his house right now. And so the king instantly says, hang him on those gallows. So in other words, Haman,
was given the very fate that he had planned for Mordecai. And behold, this calmed down the anger of the king. Chapter 8, verse 1, Scroll of Esther. On that day King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the adversary of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king because Esther had told him what he was to her. And the king took off his ring which he had removed from Haman and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther placed Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. And Esther resumed speaking before the king, and she fell before his feet, and she wept and beseeched him to avert the harm of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had plotted against the Jews. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. And she said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter is proper before the king, and I am good in his sight, let it be written to rescind the letters, the device of Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all of the king's provinces. For how can I see the evil that will befall my people, and how can I see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, the house of Haman I have given to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he laid a hand on the Jews. And you, write about the Jews as you see fit, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for a writ that is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be rescinded. And the king's scribes were summoned at that time, in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews and to the satraps and to the governors and the princes of the provinces from Hodu to Cush, 127 provinces, every province according to its script, and every nationality according to its tongue, and to the Jews according to their script and according to their tongue. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's ring, and he sent the letters by the couriers on horseback, the riders of the king's steeds, the camels, bred of the dromedaries, that the king had given to the Jews who are in every city the right to assemble and to protect themselves, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish the entire host of every people and province that oppressed them, small children and women, and to take their spoils for plunder. And one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The copy of the writ was that an edict be given in every province, published before all the peoples, and that the Jews be ready for the day to avenge themselves upon their enemies. The couriers, those who ride the king's steeds, the camels, went out hastened and pressed by the king's order, and the edict was given in Shushan the capital. And Mordecai left the king's presence with royal raiment blue and white, and a huge golden crown, and a wrap of linen and purple, and the city of Shushan shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and joy, and gladness and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's order and his edict reached, there was joy and gladness for the Jews, a banquet and a festive day, and many of the peoples of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews was upon them. End of chapter 8. So here we see Esther now goes to seal the deal. She has successfully pleaded and given the ring. Haman's ring is taken and given to Mordecai. So he is put in charge of the house of Haman. So in other words, he has now been made the master of all that wealth. And Esther continues, and she once again pleads, and the king accepts and says, please let it be written to undo the decree that was to kill my people and instead save them. But the king says, listen, you take the ring I've given you, and you can give a law according to whatever words you say. But keep in mind, once the law of the king has been made, a king's decree cannot be undone. So this is the way of Persia. I cannot rescind the previous law, but you can make a new order that will protect you. Go ahead and do that. So that's exactly what they do. They write it so that the Jews can assemble and defend themselves, and also basically fight back and take whatever they get out of it as a result. So the old decree was everybody kill the Jews and take whatever you want. The counter decree is the Jews are ordered that they could fight back and they could take whatever they get from the people that they defend against. So in a single day, all this is distributed across the kingdom with expedient horses. They save the Jews with this information, and the edict is given all over. Mordecai leaves with beautiful clothing and garments, and all the city of Shushan rejoices. The Jews had hope. It says light and joy, gladness and honor, and all across, wherever the king's order and his edict reached, there was a joy and gladness for the Jews, a banquet and a festive day. and many peoples of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews was upon them. So, in other words, this was so intense that it actually caused a bunch of people to convert to Judaism. Now, this is a troubling statement, however. Just like after the exodus of Egypt, it says many people converted to Judaism. Some of them were in awe, so maybe they were authentic Jews, but others simply chose to convert because they saw the power of the Jews. These folks often can be referred to as the Erev Rav, the mixed multitudes who join the winning side. So this is an important statement. These people may very well be some of the harbingers or causes of calamity to befall the Jewish people in the future. This is the risk with converts of those who are inspired not through sheer love of God, but by fear of what they see. This is sometimes a danger. So I do want to bring that point up, the danger of the Erev Rav. Now we move on to chapter 9. Verse 1, Scroll of Esther. And in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day thereof, when the king's order and his edict drew near to be put into execution, on the day that the Jews' enemies looked forward to ruling over them, it was reversed. The Jews should rule over their enemies. The Jews assembled in their cities, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on those who sought to harm them. And no one stood up before them, for their fear had fallen upon all the peoples. And all the provinces of the provinces, and the satraps, and the governors, and those that conduct the king's affairs, elevated the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went forth throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. And the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and with slaying and destruction, and they did to their enemies as they wished. And in Shushan the capital the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And Parshdanta, and Dalphon, and Aspata, and Porata, and Adalia, and Aridata, and Parmashta, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vaizata, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamedata, the adversary of the Jews, they slew, but on the spoil they did not lay their hands. On that day, the number of those slain in Shushan the capital came before the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, In Shushan the capital the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman. In the rest of the king's provinces what have they done? Now, what is your petition, and it shall be granted you? And what is your request, and it shall be done? And Esther said, If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews to do as today's decree, and let them hang Haman's 10 sons on the gallows. Now the king ordered that it be done so, and the decree was given in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. Now the Jews who were in Shushan assembled on the 14th day of Adar as well, and they slew in Shushan 300 men, but upon the spoils they did not lay their hands. And the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled and protected themselves, and had rest from their enemies and slew their foes, 75,000, but upon the spoil they did not lay their hands. On the 13th of the month of Adar, and they rested on the 14th thereof, and made it a day of feasting and joy. And the Jews who were in Shushan assembled on the 13th thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and rested on the 15th thereof, and made it a day of feasting and joy. Therefore the Jewish villagers who live in open towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of joy and feasting, and a festive day, and of sending portions to one another. And Mordecai inscribed these things, and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to enjoin them to make the 14th day of the month of Adar, and the 15th day thereof, every year, as the days when the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month that was reversed for them from grief, to joy, and from mourning, to a festive day, to make them days of feasting and joy, and sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews took upon themselves what they had commenced to do, and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had devised to destroy the Jews, and he cast the pur, that is, the lot, to terrify them and destroy them. And when she came before the king, he commanded through letters that his evil device that he had devised against the Jews return upon his own head, and to destroy him and his sons on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, and what they saw concerning this matter, and what happened to them, the Jews ordained and took upon themselves and upon their seed and upon all those who join them, that it is not to be revoked to make these 2 days according to their script and according to their appointed time every year. And these days shall be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation and every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim shall not be revoked from amidst the Jews, and their memory shall not cease from their seed. Now Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote down all the acts of power to confirm the second Purim letter. And he sent letters to all the Jews to 127 provinces, the realm of Ahasuerus, words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had ordained for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fasts and their cry. Now Esther's order confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was inscribed in the book. End of chapter 9. So here we see the full rundown on the 12th month, the 13th day of Adar. The king's edict comes into pass. The Jews' enemies looked at taking over the Jews and killing them, instead had the reversal of fortune. The Jews counterattack, and they instead are the ones who win. Now, what's interesting is that it says that they get to do it again the second day, so they end up killing another huge number of people, but they don't take the loot this time. They took the loot the first time, but not the second time. So I think that's kind of interesting, because maybe they left it behind for the poor. That's also why it says, that this will be a day where you give gifts to your fellow man and to the poor, because they left the spoils behind, which meant other people could take them. Now, putting that aside, it also says that all of the sons of Haman were hanged as well on the same gallows. So it was a reversal of fortune for the Jews, given instead to Haman and his house. From there, they also don't take the treasure from what they would have gotten from doing that. 500 men and 10 sons of Haman were killed. What shall be done? What else have they done in the other provinces? And Esther basically says, let them do it tomorrow. So yeah, day 1, they take the treasure. Day 2, they don't take the treasure. And the men are hanged as well. And so it says 300 men were slain the next day in Shushan, but they did not take the spoils. Likewise, 75,000 were slain across the provinces, but they did not take their spoils. All these things are written down and documented, and they are put in the book, and it's spread throughout that this is going to be a statute for all the Jews of all time to remember Purim and what happened here, the reversal of fortune of the casting of the lot, called the Por. So in other words, the festival is called Purim, which means lots, plural, because it was all a matter of divination and lots and things like that. So this is why it's called Purim. They pass this on throughout all generations, and it also says that this is written in the book. So I'm assuming this refers to inscribed in the book of the scribes, the book of the Chronicles of the Persians. So this is formally documented within Persian history. Unfortunately, if you try to find this book, you can't find it, but it's obviously, to me, like, this is not one of those books that seems like unrealistic. It makes sense that the kings would have their own written history that they keep documented, but the Persian Empire is gone. So we don't have access to this book. Many empires have such a thing that chronicles their history. But it says that during this time, while Mordecai is in this office that he got from Haman, he has put this in the scripture of the Chronicles of the Persians, so that it is basically recorded history for their historical record. Chapter 10, verse 1, the final chapter of the book of Esther. And King Ahasuerus imposed a tribute on the land and on the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and his might, and the full account of Mordecai's greatness, how the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was viceroy to the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted by most of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all their seed. End of chapter 10, end of the scroll of Esther. So it says here, it ends with a tribute imposed, so a tax. He imposes a tribute on the land, though it's curious if perhaps instead of a tribute, it says he imposed a tribute rather than a tax, so it may be that he actually gave the gift to everybody. So perhaps that Ahasuerus gave gifts to all the kingdom, all the empire. And all this is documented in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. So it says about Mordecai that he was a great fellow and that he was beloved by his people and sought to bring them peace and goodness. So this is the closing brief epilogue to the story. It seems that all of Persian Empire receives gifts because of what has happened. Mordecai is appointed viceroy. It is very much a case of Joseph and the Pharaoh happening once again. The Persian Empire, again, not an enemy to the Jews. People want to call Ahasuerus wicked, or they say bad things about Ahasuerus. looks to me like he was pretty devoted to his wife, and he loved her very much and was willing to give anything to her. And also that he was not a wretched man who saw that he had, I forgot to honor Mordecai. I need to fix that. Shame on me, right? So that's the takeaway. There's a lot to consider here, but I think the real key of the story is that the Persian Empire is not the enemy of the Israelites, but that does not mean that they are safe. It was a lesson that, they say that all of the people of Israel lived under the Persian Empire at this time. They were all there. So this was a genuine threat to the existential future of the Jews. All the Judeans were living under Persian rule. So if the king wanted to exterminate them, he very well could have. He didn't because of this miracle, because of Esther. But also it's worth noting that Mordecai said, deliverance will come from somewhere else. Better that it come from you, right? In other words, it's better that you use your position to secure this victory than to leave it to God to appoint someone else. So in other words, the Jews are going to survive no matter what, but you have the ability to make it you that's responsible for it. So that's kind of the key takeaway from Purim. But it is all a very big reversal of fortunes, and of course, the information is power. Esther kept her heritage a secret for a very long time. And I think that's a very valuable thing. It's not necessarily something that you have to tell other people. Sometimes it is better to wait. Sometimes it's better to not say it at all. Biases and prejudice can sometimes cause problems when a person who would otherwise treat you honestly has a bias or a prejudice. They will not treat you fairly. So instead, it's much better to speak as equals and keep all the personal stuff secret until a better time. In any case, this has been the story of Esther. Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Weekly Parashahcast. Certainly a doozy. For those listening, I do encourage a participation in the fast of Esther, at least for one day each Purim, and also make sure, even though you've listened to my show, it is considered right to go and hear this story heard in the Hebrew language. Go and congregate wherever you can with other celebrants, and be sure to bring presents and gifts to others that they may enjoy. Until next time, this has been Shmuel Moshe with the Weekly Parashahcast saying thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in next time. Until then, as always, Baruch Hashem.